I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Mark Scala, and I'm the Chief Curator here at the Frisch Center for the Visual Arts. And my counterpart is Jochen Virich, the Chief Curator at Cheekwood Museum and Botanical Gardens. Or is it Botanical Gardens and Museum? Tonight it'll be Museum. Tonight we'll call it Museum and Botanical Gardens. Just don't tell anybody. Okay. So. Let me begin by speaking about the genesis of the project, at least from our perspective. We were approached 3 or 4 years ago by Jane McLeod, currently Jane McLeod, and Jochen. Jane had worked at the Nasher Museum in Dallas, and they had done a major Jaume Plensa exhibition there to great success. And they invited us to partner with them, to collaborate with them in some way, shape, or form. Now, I've been a big fan of Jaume Plensa's work for quite some time. One of my favorite galleries in New York is Gallery Lalonde, and I've seen a lot of his installations. Some outdoor work, I hadn't seen that much, but what I had seen had completely blown me away. It just seemed like a perfect partnership because Cheekwood has, in addition to the beautiful home itself, the incredible gardens that I knew that Jaume would be so attracted to, he wouldn't be able to say no once he saw them. And of course, we have a beautiful galleries, not quite the grounds that Cheekwood has, not nearly the grounds that Cheekwood has, but it just seemed like a very, very logical partnership because Jaume's work is as striking indoors as it is outdoors, but in a very different way. And part of what we'll talk about tonight is that shift between the indoors and the outdoors. So I'd like to thank Jane. I don't know if she's here tonight, Jane McLeod, the executive director of Cheekwood. Thank Jochen, the entire team at Cheekwood. I found that it's very dangerous to start thanking people individually. You all know why, because you forget people. But certainly the registration team, the installation, logistics, marketing, communications, development, design, the whole works, both at Cheekwood and at the Frisch Center for the Visual Arts. This is a very, very complicated project. It's international shipping, logistics, tremendously complex. And I'd like to say that Cheekwood and we pulled it off without a hitch. I'd like to say that, but we don't need to talk about that. So, and before I'm going to ask Jochen to start by speaking a little bit about the project at Cheekwood itself and some of the thoughts that he had as he developed the project as the project manager and curator. Before I do, I would like to make our traditional thanks and acknowledgement to the Metro Nashville Arts Commission, the Tennessee Arts Commission, and the National Endowment for the Arts, all of whom support our programs. Every program that we do is supported by those three entities. If you see anybody who works for them, thank them on our behalf. So Jochen, let's talk a little bit about the collaboration, about the exhibition, about your experiences. You're an Americanist, by the way.
Right.
You're a 19th century Americanist.
Right. Well, first I want to confess that I didn't know about Jaume Plensa until just a few years ago when I saw his sculptures, his famous sculpture, Crown Fountain, which we'll talk about in a minute, in Chicago. And, but of course I also have the excuse that I'm an Americanist, so I don't need to pay as much attention to contemporary art as you do. But it's been a really wonderful experience, and at Cheekwood, we have an American art collection that I exhibit indoors. We also have a contemporary sculpture trail that makes us unique, and we've also been working with sculptors in bringing temporary exhibitions to Cheekwood to really utilize that landscape, as Mark said, that beautiful canvas, as Jane McLeod refers to it. But I want to give Jane credit because, when she was at the National Sculpture Center, so this was, I think, in 2010, Jaume Plensa had an exhibition there. But really beyond Crown Fountain, really, he hadn't had a lot of major exhibitions in the United States. The other one was at the Frederick Meyer Sculpture Garden in Michigan. So I think we all realized that really it was time for somebody to step up and do a major exhibition of Plensa's work. And again, here with the partnership, we really had, I think we had the resources here to do it.
Yeah, it's sort of amazing because Jaume has an international reputation. He is shown around the world, and you'll find I was in Calgary not too long ago, saw a great piece by him. He's been shown in Rio de Janeiro, in London, everywhere.
Yeah.
But he at this point, up to this point, had not had this kind of acknowledgement of the substance of his career, and I think that's something that is a true feather in the cap for Cheekwood.
Well, thank you. And it was an ambitious project, you know, now at Cheekwood you'll be seeing really eight or nine major outdoor sculptures. It always depends on how you count them, because
I was going to say, which is it?
Sometimes there are pairs, and then sometimes
right.
we count them as one. And then we have several indoor sculptures or installations, and about 25 or so works on paper. And so it's really, it's on a scale. The exhibition is on a scale, and then if you include the Frist part, that has not been exhibited in the United States before. And so I know that in the back is an image of, it's called Laura with Bun. And working at Cheekwood and working with the outdoors, what intrigues me always is how artists occupy that landscape, how they occupy that historic landscape. And I think with Plensa, we have an artist here who really, I think, is very aware of historic spaces, and kind of bringing the present and the past and the future in some ways together through his works. And with Laura with Bun, which is, of course, it's a very large cast iron piece, which has a companion piece here at the Frist, which
a twin sister.
It's got her twin, Isabella. But I think from this slide you can see how what is kind of our traditional gateway, right? The front gate to Cheekwood really is transformed by this sculpture, and I think that is one of the great, I guess, innovations of Plensa, is that in the way they're sited and then the way they're placed, they always transform in many ways the environment where they are.
What occurs to me, you as an Americanist are very familiar, of course, with the 19th century American gardens and garden sculptures, and so is this something that affected your thinking with Jaume? Or is it a different thing?
I mean, I think that it's interesting that, and I'll talk in a few minutes a little bit more about sculpture parks, sculpture gardens in the United States. And one of the first sculpture parks in the United States was in South Carolina, and I'm blanking on the name right now, but I want to say it's Brookside? Brook Green, thank you.
I knew somebody from South Carolina.
I was hoping somebody would help me. And that started actually in the 1930s. That was really one of the first in the United States. It was dedicated to the artist Anna Hyatt Huntington, who worked in bronze. And she did mostly animals, and so I could see that maybe there's a kind of a lineage here, yeah. But it's certainly also it's a real new chapter in the history of sculpture, and especially in public gardens. I have another slide if you don't mind forwarding that. The Heart of Trees is one of Plensa's iconic pieces. He's shown this now in different scenarios, different contexts. Here at Cheekwood, it sort of fills a space that sometimes is used for events, and so it really animates that landscape. We had to plant trees for this. There's 7 of them. And it brings up certain sort of themes that you'll be seeing here in this sequence of images that we'll be showing you. And one is, of course, the human body, kind of with the legs up, pressed to the chest, and here embracing a tree. So the idea of the sort of the body as a kind of I guess a mortal being, and then the idea of growth, life, regeneration, and the cycle of life. Music. Jaume Plensa basically engraved on these bronze sculptures the names of his most popular or his most favorite composers, and so music, language, the body, and nature all together here. And then maybe one more from Cheekwood, and then we'll.
Sorry.
So thoughts is one piece that, as you can see here, really occupies the landscape. It's placed at this what's called mustard meadow, where it sort of looks down on the landscape. It's almost like a what's it called, a substitute or a surrogate for the observer, for the viewer. Thoughts, of course, is a very abstract idea, but again, it's based on the human figure, and again, the idea of the human figure in the landscape, in a sense, participating in those vistas, and the vistas, of course, were created as part of the historic landscape. So again, the past and the present intersecting in these sculptural environments.
See the detail.
There's a beautiful detail. So this thoughts sculpture is essentially created from these bands of stainless steel with lines from poets. So it's another big theme in Plensa's work is the idea of poetry and incorporating poetry into the work, and so here in a kind of very sort of abstract way, and the way I guess also oftentimes our mind works is sort of in this abstract fashion.
Well, let's change gears a little bit. This is something that you probably recognize. It's the Parthenon. It was really interesting to me. I've had many conversations with Jaume, as I'm sure Jochen has as well, and it didn't surprise me a bit when Jaume sort of classified himself as an artist of the Mediterranean. Of course, he's shown his work around the world. He had a beautiful installation of a head coming out of the water in Rio de Janeiro. So the Mediterranean, I think, symbolizes to him all seas, the beauty of all seas. But also, he's very sensitive to the qualities of light. And the way the light in the Mediterranean is so intense that it in some ways seems to transform or even dematerialize the substance that it's reflected from. And so a lot of his work has to do with using materials in a way that contradict the nature of the same material. I'm showing you the Parthenon, of course, because it's a way of helping us all embrace this artist of the Mediterranean, because we're all, by proxy, fans of the Mediterranean as well, because we all love the Parthenon. We just need to have a little bit of sea lapping up against the coastline of Tennessee. We'll have to work on that. But I think this notion of the Mediterranean and broadening that out to the idea of the classical world. If you look at a lot of his works, you might sense a connection to ancient statuary from Rome or from Greece. The same notion of the beautiful, the harmonic, the ideal body as a symbol for universal or cosmic cohesiveness, cosmic coherence. This idea of the union of the human with the divine, I think, is something that appeals very much to Jaume. He may not be particularly religious himself, I don't really know, but I think this notion of divinity, this notion of spirituality is something that he embraces. And so when you go into our galleries and see the installation in the Gordon Contemporary Artist Project Gallery, the first work that you come to is the monumental, maybe not monumental, he doesn't like that word, but the fairly large head of Laura II. And you see immediately that connection to this classical statuary. You see the beauty, the symmetry, the sense of grace, the inward-looking qualities. The head of Athena on your left doesn't have eyes, but I think that in some ways that's a premonition of Jaume's way of treating a lot of his figures with their eyes closed. It's an inward-looking sensibility. These are very, very poetic and psychological works, especially the interior works. I think it's interesting to compare the interior works to the exterior works. This notion of fragmentation, the idea of stone itself as being something that exists perpetually, and of course it doesn't. And when we look at ancient statuary, we don't feel necessarily from our eyes that it is diminished by the rigors of time, by the cracking and the fracturing and having been pulled up from the bottom of the Mediterranean, or having been hit with a hammer by an iconoclast. All of these things become part of its beauty and part of its history, and I think that's something that is true when you look at a fragmented work like Laura 2 as well.
What I want to talk about next is the idea of the sculptural environment and how the context defines how we look at a sculpture and vice versa. And this is one of the great views at Cheekwood. And Jaume Plensa decided to put a marble sculpture there by the reflecting pool. And
so this is like the Mediterranean.
Well, almost.
In many ways. Yes.
And just to dispel this myth, maybe that people think that this was a swimming pool. It was not a swimming pool. It was purely decorative when the Cheeks lived there. But again, it sets up this interesting conversation between the work and the existing landscape. And if you may be able to see this, but at the side of the pool are two sort of allegorical sculptures that are very classical. And this made me think about, and if you don't mind, go to the next slide. This made me think about how there is this tradition of, sculpture and water, and especially Versailles, probably most well-known Baroque European garden, the pleasure garden outside of Paris. And you see here just one example of how sculptural features were used along water features, the playfulness of fountains but I mean I do really think that obviously with Plensa there's a very different way of that dialogue and how that happens, that dialogue between sculpture and water. And if we go forward, if for instance you think about the sculpture park itself, a park dedicated to sculpture, where sculpture is not just a garden ornament. That is a concept of the 20th century. We mentioned earlier South Carolina, but really. Here in the United States, it started more or less with Storm King in upstate New York, which is I think 200-acre or so park dedicated to sculpture, mostly abstract and modern. The Frederick Meyer is one that I mentioned earlier. That's one of the great examples in the United States, and there's so many more now. De Cordova,
Lauermeyer, yeah, there's some great ones.
And the one that is often mentioned as a really wonderful place to see outdoor sculpture is Yorkshire Sculpture Park, and I haven't been there, but the other. Jaume Plensa had an exhibition at the Yorkshire Sculpture Park, and so it's one that's a little bit similar to Cheekwood. Also, it's a sort of a historic landscape. But I wanted to show you one, Henry Moore and at Yorkshire. That's a sort of an example of how an artist, Henry Moore, for instance, a modern artist, how a space is dedicated to to the enjoyment of his work. I'm also. I could also think of more urban spaces where, sculpture has a dedicated space, like, Chicago has dedicated spaces for Alexander Calder and Picasso and so on. So that sculpture is now part of our sort of our sensibility of whether it's gardens or urban spaces, of seeing modern art. And I think that with Plensa maybe there might be a new level of experiencing sculpture. If you want to go to the next. So this is again at Cheekwood now. This is Plensa's self-portrait at Cheekwood inside what is called the Wills Garden, which is a kind of perennial garden, and you see it here in May. And it's clearly something here. Plensa's sculpture is clearly very much embedded in the landscape. It really is in this kind of really natural, organic place where it almost seems like it's growing out of the earth, and it becomes almost like a plant. And so it has this way of, I think, of shaping the landscape, but also being shaped by the landscape. And then if you want to go to the next one, thank you, the detail of, so essentially there's this sphere, and it's created out of letters and different alphabets, and then inside there's another figure. And so it's again this kind of interesting duality, and you'll talk a little bit more about that.
This idea of duality, I mean, I think that if you just look at the name of the show, Human Landscape, I think it's a great, brilliant name because of works like this. It really makes that connection between humanity and nature, and shows that the two are not distinct from each other, but there is this conversation. Each forms the other, each affects the other, each kind of breathes into the other, and even the empty spaces between the elements of this sculpture show that passage from inside to outside. So this idea of a dialectic, a duality, or a conversation is the thing that led me to misremember the name of the exhibition early on. I was thinking in my mind that the exhibition was called Human Nature and not Human Landscape. And of course, Jaume thoughtfully corrected me. But the idea of human nature, I think, also contains that same notion. But if we move back to the Frisch Center, move back to the interior, the idea of the figure within a room, within an almost claustrophobic setting, becomes a very different read, I think, than the figures out in the landscape. When it's out in the landscape, it's in conversation with light. It's in conversation with trees and water and hills. Here, within the galleries, they seem to be more in conversation with themselves. And so there is a much more, to me, psychological reading to the works that we have inside our galleries, and actually the works that you have inside your galleries, than there is to the works that are outside. This idea of the duality is really embodied in See No Evil, Hear No Evil, Speak No Evil. This is these figures Jaume refers to as fat angels who cannot fly. And that just really kind of captures the whole sense of it. They look heavy, they look weighty, but they also seem to be floating up in space. So they're earthbound and yet not earthbound at the same time. Like a lot of artists, Jaume doesn't really like it when curators talk about other artists in the context of his work, because his work is original and unique. But as an art historian, I think it's really interesting to see if there are other connections, other artists who are interested in some of the same ideas, and what does that tell us? What does that tell us about art? What does that tell us about culture? So I thought it would be interesting to compare Jaume's work to this work by Bruce Nauman. Bruce Nauman is a very important, very well-known American artist who did a series of cast figures, cast heads or cast body parts, oftentimes arms, that for whom the subcontext is always a sense of dismemberment or dislocation, a kind of removal from the wholeness that the body represents. And I think that is in some ways relevant to Jaume's work. It reminds me of Linda Naucklin's very, very famous book, actually lecture that she turned into a book on 19th century French art, and it's called The Body in Pieces, The Fragment as a Metaphor of modernity. And I think that that's really relevant to Naumann's work. Nachlin talked about the guillotine not just as an instrument of essentially state terror, but also as a symbol for the separation of the head or the intellect or the rationality from the body, from intuition, from desire, from all of those things that the body represents. And I do think Naumann is capturing a sense of anxiety, a sense of psychological distortion that in some ways relates to Plensa's work. If you have been in the gallery and have looked very closely at the heads, you can see the expression of distress that are on the faces of these fat angels who cannot fly. You can see, you might be able to read the words on the forehead. Can you all read the words on the forehead? I'm not going to turn around. Can you tell me what they say? Hysteria and anxiety. Okay, so this idea of an internal dispute, I think, is really critical to an understanding of Plensa's work. He doesn't idealize humanity. He recognizes the ideal within humanity, but he doesn't idealize. He also recognizes the other things, the darkness that's within humanity. So I think it's an instructive comparison. I'm not thinking that he and Naumann are on the same page with things, but there are a lot of artists who do work with the body as being a symbol for a lot of conflicting impulses and tensions that symbolize the world. And another side of Jaume's view on humanity has to do with spirituality. The idea of light sources. He oftentimes uses light, whether it's from without or from within, to give the sense of a soul, give the sense of a spirit, an animating force from within. And I can't help but look at the see no evil, speak no evil, hear no evil, and remember that just before that, in the same gallery, we had the wonderful exhibition by the Los Angeles Pasadena artist Helen Pashkian. And Helen Pashkian created the work called Light Invisible, and very, very beautiful, very poetic, and dedicated to the notion of light as a transcendental force. We all know light as a symbol for knowledge. We know light as a symbol for the dissipation of the physical into the spiritual and something transcendent, something that induces contemplation. So I think there is that in a lot of Jaume's work, whether it's inside or outside, this notion of the importance of light as a way of dematerializing your experience. I think that as we look back at works at Cheekwood, think now about the relationship between the material and the light and the installation.
Yeah. Awilda and Irma, two mesh heads, light can be also something very dramatic and mesmerizing, this is certainly I encourage you all to come see the exhibition at night.
See it at day, and then go back and see it at night.
Yeah.
Very exciting, amazing transformation.
But it's an interesting convergence of sculpture and light, whether it's daylight or nighttime. And I'll show you in a minute also a daytime shot of this. And for Plensa, this was a really wonderful opportunity to show these two mesh heads in a new light, so to say. He had shown two mesh heads in Yorkshire, which I mentioned to you earlier, where they were on top of this green roof that was on top of a gallery. So also a kind of a very sort of an intervention. But I also know that when he came to Cheekwood and he saw these ponds, it was like, for him, this was just a new space where these pieces could live. So he created two new mesh heads for Cheekwood, Awilda and Irma, who are, by the way, real women that he met in Barcelona, and they're both from the Dominican Republic, so they're immigrants to Spain. But again, at night, what is the stainless steel that can be a kind of like a little bit of a dull material really starts to shine, and glow, as you can see, and it's a little bit sort of almost like disorienting when you stand in front of these pieces that's reflected, because you see the reflection, and it's that kind of interesting sensation of you know, a double vision and mirror effect.
Yeah, and it reiterates that notion of floating and the sensation of just lightness. The material has nothing to do with actual gravity or actual weight.
Right.
That's great.
One other thing I will mention is that it is really a kind of multi-sensory experience, because when you come to Cheekwood and you're down there by the ponds, you can't miss hearing the frogs, and they're loud.
Do the frogs actually climb on the sculpture and jump
We
on it?
had, yes, we had a frog, a toad, climb on one of those. So again, just be prepared that it will be a very multi-sensory experience, which
Snakes,
I know.
snakes,
I don't know about
turtles.
the snakes, but well, you know, just wear some boots. And then this is the shot of the two pieces at daytime, and you can see the difference. At the same time, also it is still a very sensory experience, and again the idea of water. I wanted to sort of, that's why I mentioned also Versailles, and I think that in some ways Plensa is sort of takes a kind of delight in working with spaces that evoke also history and evoke the kind of maybe even those Baroque garden environments, but in a completely new context. And you also probably may or may not know that some of these portraits are computer generated. So you know, the idea of a mesh, you can kind of generate that on the computer, and then of course here it's on a very different scale. So new technology and old landscape, that kind of dialogue. Yeah. And so the idea, if you want to move on, the idea of the two mesh heads brings me to talk a little bit about Crown Fountain, which we mentioned. Many of you have probably seen it in Chicago, where there's two towers essentially facing each other. Again, the idea of the fountain, and sort of we have these echoes, right? The echoes of water sculpture, water-based, and so you see one of Plensa's towers on the left, and with the glass and the video projection, he videotaped about 1,000 Chicagoans, and then they're all projected.
Yeah, it's pretty spectacular. And this was basically installed at the same time as the Anish Kapoor, right? So that's why we have that up there. In case anybody doesn't know Jaume's work, you probably have seen The Bean, the Anish Kapoor. So it's in the same park, in the same environment. So it's really, it's so exciting to go to Chicago. You can't go to Chicago and not go to Millennium Park.
Right. Now the Anish Kapoor, I don't mean to correct you, but it is called Cloudgate. I know people call it The Bean, but the official title is Cloudgate.
Thank you.
But I'll let you get. You can use the Bean term. Okay. That's fine. But I think the interesting point here, the juxtaposition of those two pieces, is that they're both in a way kind of reflecting, right? They're reflecting something, and Anish Kapoor is this sort of stainless steel that's almost like a mirror, and reflects the visitors and reflects the city around it, and in the same way Plensa's work, in a sense, is kind of a reflection of the city. Yeah. And to me, there's a kind of maybe a response to also the idea that sculpture is maybe a democratic medium, and that it invites people to participate and interact. And then I have one more example of Plensa's work in public spaces. Again, large scale work here. A piece called Echo in Madison Square Park. This is about 2011, so Chicago was 2004. So Plensa continues to receive these large commissions in the United States. This one was temporary, and the piece is now permanently installed in Seattle at the Olympic Sculpture Park. But again, I think sculpture has this, especially I think with Plensa, sculpture has the capability of being sited in spaces that are already public, right? That are already, in a sense, kind of gathering places, and then here with Echo, it's this dialogue with places that are already used by people to gather, and so that's another, I think, beautiful aspect of his work.
Yeah, very much a social kind of magnet, I think.
Yeah. So I think, yeah.
Well, this is, I think, an interesting example of context. If you have been to Cheekwood, and if you've been to the Frisch Center, we know you've been to the Frisch Center, you will have seen Laura here, and Laura with, is it Laura Woodbun? Or Isabella here and Laura Woodbun there. And so they do seem very closely connected to one another. Clearly, as Jochen said, a lot of his work is designed on the computer, and there is that connection, and as you go around it, you'll see the work is actually kind of collapsed onto itself, and it seems to be animated as you walk around it. It doesn't seem to be still, and it's a kind of an eerie effect that we have in both places, but you can see the difference. You probably had noticed the difference in each installation. You can take something that is very similar, place it in a different spot, and it behaves in a different way. So I think that's a really interesting aspect of Jaume's work, that sensitivity to place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and wanted to show one more example of a pair. Jaume Plensa really seems to think oftentimes about two sort of pieces of a same type, of a same kind in conversation, and these two stainless steel painted white sculptures. They sit on it's called the Color Garden lawn at Cheekwood, and they're sitting in this bed of white marble stones, and I think it goes back to what Mark was talking about with classicism, right? There's a kind of classical balance about these pieces.
The title of this is pretty great, Soul of Words, and I'm sure you've noticed the use of text and alphabets and typography in Plensa's work. What would you say he's conveying with a title like Soul of Words?
Well, I think oftentimes the titles they want to make us think, and they want to make us maybe ponder a little bit. And so I think here, first of all, the use of the different alphabets, and I can't remember all the different alphabets that he uses: Latin, Greek, Arabic, Chinese, and so on. It sort of creates this cacophony, right? Of
A babble.
Babel,
Yeah.
but at the same time also, Plensa is a multilingual artist. He speaks several languages. So there's a kind of dream too, the dream of sort of multilingual communication and polyglot and so on. And so I think that language does have the ability to be a real extension of who we are, even though it also is full of potential for miscommunication and so on. And so I think that's kind of where I think the title comes into play. I was also thinking about, as I was preparing for this conversation, about the idea of tattoos and how, you know, I mean, tattoos are now so popular, and I think it has also something to do with maybe not just the appearance, but also the soul, right? Sort of something that we carry on the skin, maybe that is an extension of us.
So revelation, sort of a self-revelation, you mean?
Yeah.
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 So these are like tattoos without a body.
Without a body, exactly.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, he is a poet. Jaume is a poet. He's written poetry, but he's also, from his earliest childhood, he remembers being completely in love with books, with language, with literature, and his early work would oftentimes take a word or a phrase from Shakespeare, Rabelais, any number of absolutely wonderful, important authors. But I think what's really interesting is that there's been a shift now, and so now it's more about that typography. It's more about the alphabet, the Cyrillic alphabet, next to a figure from the Islamic alphabet, or a figure of Islamic calligraphy, and then English, and then Japanese, and put together in a way that actually doesn't mean anything, and he doesn't mean for it not to mean anything. It just, you can't read it. It means something else. What it means, I think, is this idea of the importance and the beauty of language itself. And in some ways, the letters, the alphabets, become objects, become things that symbolize the culture from which they grew. I'm really interested in this notion of text. You know, we just looked at the soul of words, and there are other artists who have used text. You all can think of many artists yourselves, from Jasper Johns and Edward Ruchet, who use this notion of the text as a physical object, something that has a palpable presence in the world. One of Jaume's Catalan predecessors, Joan Brossa, was a master at using text in this palpable way, the idea of the text as thing. Mira Chandel in Brazil. This is something that is, I think, a 20th century and 21st century phenomenon, probably starting with Curators very early on. But it's something that he has, I think, embraced, but then done something more with. And so the physicality of the text becomes something that forms a sheath around the air that it encloses, but then it becomes another kind of meaning. Here, this is Talking Continents, which is in our Contemporary Artist Project Gallery. This is actually an installation view from Gallery Lelong in New York. But you can see how these physical forms, these meteorites or continents or islands, are formed out of text. The bodies themselves are formed out of text. And so language itself, he's almost saying that language is as important a part of yourself as your blood, as your flesh, as your bones. Everything is essential to what it is that constitutes your own humanity. I think one of the great things about this installation, I've noticed people again and again looking at the objects kind of floating, but then becoming completely entranced by the shadows below the objects. So that idea of the dematerialization, language is completely immaterial. He's making it material, but what I'm saying to you now is lost forever. You can't grab it and you can't put it in a box. And so that immateriality, I think, is something that play between the physical and the immaterial is something that's really captured incredibly poignantly in his work with text. I think there's some great text pieces at Cheekwood.
Mm. No, and I appreciate what you just said about Talking Continents and how when you come to Cheekwood, you'll see these wonderful works on paper, and he's been working in that medium with works on paper, etchings, mixed media, etc., drawings since the 1980s. Some of the earliest examples at Cheekwood are from the early 1990s, and how consistent he is in sort of investigating this contradiction of language being something very concrete when it's written when it's on a paper, and also something very, as you said, very immaterial when it's spoken. And so there's a number of works on paper that have text and portraits. They're very, they're kind of tough. You know, how his sculptures are sometimes more accessible. We talked about the Mediterranean aspect there. The works on paper sometimes strike me as very non-Mediterranean, much more intellectual and maybe a little more obscure.
Well, sort of the German side of his background.
Which is interesting that you mention that, because his artistic career really began to flourish when he went to Berlin. He went to Berlin in the mid-'80s. Berlin was still a divided city, and I've talked a little bit with him about that, and he was so, like, to him it was just a real revelation to see this wall, and
Yeah.
you know, to basically, you know, on the other side of the wall is the other, right? Those are people that are, you know, different. They live in a different system, and so that, I think, again, is something that in some ways shaped his thinking with some of these works. This is called self-portrait, which is of course very sort of mystifying. And in this series, in this body of work, you sometimes see these portraits that seem to maybe come from like ethnographic books, you know, different ethnicities. But then he deconstructs that, sort of the way we look maybe at different ethnographies and put them into categories, and you know, and they're maybe kind of grouped by, you know, whatever geographic region or race and so on, taxonomies that we use. But in these works, he really deconstructs it, and then he also, in a way, deconstructs the idea of a work on paper, because I mean, I don't know if you can see this, but the paper actually is coming off the ground. It's slightly elevated,
Becoming sculptural, more
sculptural,
physical.
exactly.
Yeah.
And so that's, again, when you come to Cheekwood and look at these works, you know, keep in mind that there's already a kind of a different, it's sort of a pushing the boundaries and going into a more sculptural direction with these works. And then I think we have one more example of a work that's really purely about letters, and about letters actually being liberated from a page, suspended, you know, from the ceiling. It's called Silent Rain, which is an interesting kind of image too, because rain actually is not silent, right? So you can hear the rain, right? And and when you walk, these are like, you know, letters from made with metal, from, you know, metal cut, and when you walk through the curtain, they create a certain sound, and you can sort of hear the sort of tingling sound, and so he's
liberated the letters from paper, but he's also liberated the letters from the definition of the human form, that they, and instead, you walk through. Your body is the body, then, that is somehow interacting with the letters and defined by the letters. I think it's a brilliant work, really exciting, and kind of involves one physically,
right,
in a way that I think he wants all of his sculpture especially to do, to really give you that sense of being a participant, right, in the right, exercise of the work.
Right.
It's great. It's really a great piece.
Right, right. And visitors, I think, I mean, I haven't observed visitors very often, but sometimes I think it takes a while for the visitor to really feel comfortable stepping into that space, because we're so used to standing outside and just, you know, observing. And and the security guard standing there probably. That's right. That's right.
Okay, well,
so, yeah.
I think we should probably wrap it up and just open the floor to any questions or thoughts that you all have. We wanted to finish with this wonderful view of silent music, which I think is in the collection, or will be in the collection.
Yeah,
at
this
Cheekwood.
is going to stay at Cheekwood. We're acquiring it. and it may stay in this location where it's just below the mansion, or we may put it into another place, but it will be a sort of a lasting, I guess, memory of Jaume's exhibition here in Nashville.
It's a great
something
acquisition. The musical part is not lost on us. It's wonderful. You've seen several self-portraits by Jaume. This is actually what he really looks like. He's not tiny. The work is big, in case you were wondering. But we'd love to open the floor to questions. Yes?
I have a question. As you're putting this show together, how much influence did Jaume have in terms of what he chose to show and where it was going to be, or was it more collaborative as you're determining what both for the sculptures and the paper pieces in the show?
Well, it was collaborative, I think, although I had the great privilege of being able to go to Barcelona. I know Mark didn't go. I mean, that's the process, right? As a curator, you really want to work with the artist and visit the studio and make selections.
But he came to Nashville several times, which I think was really critical.
Yeah.
He had to fall in love with the location before he was even interested in working with you.
Yeah. So I think really collaborative, and then between Mark and I too, we had to sort of make sure that the two shows didn't duplicate each other necessarily, but also kind of complemented each other.
Yeah, the only duplication being Isabella and Laura, but we did that because those are both kind of situated at our entrance, and we thought symbolically it was really important to kind of stress the collaborative nature of the project. Other questions? Yes?
I wonder if there isn't another dialectic here between emerald and the material. I'm assuming that most of these, and you alluded to it briefly, were created on a computer. So they're actually digital works that then have to be fabricated.
Yeah, they were designed on a computer, certainly, yeah. And designed, but from photographs of actual people that he would take in the round and then process them through the computer. So it's a very 21st century, and I think that's really one of the interesting things about, especially the big works that we're talking about, Laura and Isabella, is that even though they have this monumentality, this kind of sense of classicism, sense of being antique in a way, you would never mistake them for that. But that, yeah, and you might mistake the piece in stone for an actual piece of classical statuary. Did that answer your question? I'm not sure it did. Okay. Yeah. Any other thoughts?
No, but it's interesting that I think when we talk about sculpture, oftentimes we do think about a certain kind of material substance, right? And all the classical sculpture that we think of, whether it's marble or stone, right, has that sort of materiality to it, and that. As Mark said, I mean, we're now dealing with a generation of artists who have all this technology at their fingertips to create, so I mean, I think it's just a different way of getting at the substance.
But I would say the technology heavily influenced
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I agree. Molly?
How attached are you to Laura? And is that going to be a difficult thing because it seems to fit? It's old Laura that she did, right? Okay, so the entryway, it looks like it belongs there. Right. As soon as I saw it, I'm like,
You're asking Jochen this question.
Right. Well, yes, yes, certainly. It sort of thinking about that, it certainly evokes a certain sadness. And people have said that is probably the piece that really should stay here. But I will say that we do these temporary exhibitions, and there's oftentimes there is that kind of, especially the outdoor exhibitions, right? They stay for a long time, and then there's that sort of that having to separate and letting go. And I know it will be the same with Laura, with Bonnie. It will be a very hard letting go. But at the same time, I always think there's a kind of a beauty to letting go and then having sort of starting over again, right? And then sort of seeing how a new sculpture might fill that space and create a new context.
It's one of the premises that I have working at an institution that does not collect, is that when you present something, when we presented Whistler's Mother a few years ago, when we presented, anything, Manet, and you've seen it and you've lived with it and you know it, you essentially own it. So when it goes away, it's not really away. I mean, it lives in here, and I think that that's going to be true certainly for anything that we, when we return the Plensas to Barcelona. It's momentary postpartum depression, but nothing that lasts for very long.
Carol?
I just want to recommend the wonderful film that you were showing about these artists. A wonderful biographic look at him and his process. It's excellent.
The one in the at Cheekwood in the and I maybe what I could one thing about that movie, if you've seen it, is that touched me greatly was the one when he goes to England to I can't remember the name of the town, and a coal mining town that had been really suffering after Margaret Thatcher closed all the coal mines, and a community that was really kind of devastated, and they did this public commission, and they commissioned Jaume Plensa to do a piece very similar to what we've seen here, white, and then there's this video that shows him going to the opening, and it's a very moving and touching experience.
Speaking of the film, there is a catalog in the works for this exhibition, and the reason that the catalog wasn't ready at the beginning of the show, which traditionally one likes to do, is that Cheekwood thought that the most important thing was to have photographs of the installation views on the grounds, and so that will be ready fairly soon, and I know you're all going to want to buy the catalog. It's going to be spectacular.
Buy it at both locations at the same price.
A couple of really good writers who wrote to the catalog.
And 2 good writers. And before I forget it, I'm supposed to make one other announcement, which is if you want to see the exhibition at night at Cheekwood, you can still go tonight because we have the family night out, and then we have an extended opening, I think until 10 p.m. tonight. And then also we'll be open again late for Spanish night, which is August 7th. And Spanish night is sort of a Spanish-themed night at Cheekwood with tapas and poetry readings and music. So
beautiful. Okay, if there are no other questions, thank you all very much for coming.
thank you very much.